Does art television make art history? To answer that question, I think we need to understand the nature of art on television. Art programs are generic by their very nature, and they come in three standard formats. There's the artist profile, a half-hour program about a single artist, interviews with them, examples of their work. The arts magazine show, which is the staple art show in Australia, Sunday Arts, Art Nation and so on. And then there's the landmark series. I want to talk about the last of these generic forms. This is the format that my own work in television has been modelled on. But the landmark series also points to the problematic relationship between art TV and the creation of a consciousness about the context of art making and its reception by TV audiences. The big problem with putting art on television is that art generally doesn't do anything. It just sits there forlornly as it gets flattened by the TV screen. Somehow the seeing and the feeling and the hearing that can make an art gallery such a dynamic space, and that an art itself as an emotional experience, well, that has to be somehow translated or recreated on TV. The approach to translating art and art making into an accessible form for general audiences has been through presenters, usually white men in suits with specialist knowledge, sometimes connoisseurs of the old school, the tradition of middle-aged middlemen that goes back about 40 years. In the late 1960s, David Attenborough was then the head of BBC Two in the UK, and he commissioned Sir Kenneth Clarke to write and present a 13-part series called Civilization. The idea for the show was simple enough. As a former director of the National Gallery in London, a curator of Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, keeper of the King's pictures, and a sales agent for many of the NGV's fake masterpieces, and in his day, a sometimes controversial conservative critic, Clarke would offer his considerable gravitas and posh-toned voice to the history of Western civilization as seen through its art.
Ruskin said, great nations write their autobiographies in 3 manuscripts: the book of their deeds, the book of their words, and the book of their art. Not one of these books can be understood unless we read the 2 others, but of the 3, the only trustworthy one is the last. On the whole, I think this is true.
The production of this series, which screened on British television in 1969, was basic. A camera followed the presenter through various vaulted palaces and galleries as classical music played mellifluously on the soundtrack. Clarke offered historical facts and his insights before moving on to the next example. And through this series, the template of the landmark art series was set. If art television makes an art history, it has been a history of the most traditional kind. This type of art program has nearly always been about the canon of Western art, a history of art making, say, from the Renaissance or even earlier to the contemporary period. They rarely, if ever, question the notion of the canon, and they tend towards a very orthodox view, a very orthodox ordering of art experience in televisual terms. Art is found in art galleries, sometimes in the studios of living artists, sometimes out in the field on plein air. And the approach has been to, jazz up the visuals with locations, music and snappy editing. The authored landmark documentary is essentially a British conversation, combining the tradition of the public lecture with the egalitarian post-war philosophy of making high culture accessible for the everyman. Most of the genre's best early examples were English, from Jacob Bronowski's Ascent of Man from 1973, which was a landmark series on the evolution of culture, to David Attenborough's own hugely influential series, natural history series, Life on Earth from 1979. And there have been a few American examples, most notably Carl Sagan's Cosmos from 1980. But when it comes to the subject of art, the author documentary has been largely a British conversation. The only series that offered a sustained critique of the canon of art and the notion of an art history, as well as the ways in which TV is made, was John Berger's Ways of Seeing from 1973. Berger was high on Walter Benjamin's Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and he challenged every underlying assumption about civilization's view of history, from the notion of high culture to the ownership of art, from how art is shown on TV to its reception by common folk, which in Berger's terms were women and children. Berger upended the conventions of the landmark series genre and did it in 4 very brief 30-minute episodes. Watched today, I think Ways of Seeing is unbearably self-conscious and condescending. It's painfully slow, but it's completely unique. It remains an unassailable oddity. The landmark series is a way of thinking about art that, despite Berger's best attempts, has remained largely unchanged in the minds of TV makers and in the minds of audiences. The form is familiar, it's comforting in the same way that a detective show is comforting. The outcome of the whodunit is largely irrelevant because we all know we're going to get the answer at the end. It's about the details, it's about the finding out that's interesting. Perhaps the most remembered landmark art series is Robert Hughes' Shock of the Nude from 1980. This 8-part series was not Hughes' first foray into television. In 1970, Hughes was Time magazine's art critic based in New York, and there he co-hosted a local TV news magazine show that lasted just one feeble episode before he was replaced. Undaunted, he returned to Sydney to make Landscape with Figures in 1975 for the ABC, which was a history of Australian art from white settlement to the present day, based in part on his own art history, The Art of Australia, published in 1970. His familiar, stentorian, authoritative voice was in place, but his on-screen manner was decidedly ill at ease. He was flamboyant, with shoulder-length hair, and he stuck his Cuban heel right into the windpipe of the tradition of Australian figurative painting, and he pressed down hard. 5 years later, when he made Shock of the New, the Hughes we know now is in place. Suit, tie, his hair was under control, and a voice that sounded like Moses himself laying down the commandments. The series was a confidently modern take on art, looking at social context and inspiration as much as the end result, the painting on the wall, thereby getting around the age-old problem of the inert artwork.
The wish for absolute freedom is one of the constants of intellectual life, and in France it amounts to a tradition. This tradition is more anarchist than Marxist. It wants to reform reality in the shape of desire, and by uniting people with their desires, it wants to change all life. It is ironic and scarcely ideological at all. It boasts of its absolute modernity, but its roots lie in the 18th century. It seeks spontaneity, but it's doomed to failure when it runs up against the real world. Its enemies are priest, cop, bureaucrat, boss, and censor. But it's too highbrow to have a broad base. It breathes the air of privilege and is self-indulgent. Generally, workers don't like it, and socialists reject it as impractical, which it is. It is the product of young, middle-class people fed up with their own assigned social role. The last time it surfaced in France was in May 1968. But the time before that, it took a more complicated and aesthetic form and called itself surrealism.
It's rather an odd experience watching Shock of the New now, not least for the fact that it was made at a time when modernism was thought to be in good health. The notion of history as a sequence of connected events, a succession of isms and movements, was unquestioned in the popular consciousness, and Hughes' series stuck close to the canonical view of art history. This excerpt we just saw was from an episode on surrealism. With the last half of the 20th century still unfolding, events like those in Paris in May 1968 were relatively fresh, and Hughes' approach was to connect one revolution of the mind to another almost revolution. The language of art television seen here, montage, music, archival examples, filtered through personal observation and opinion, are not that different to Clarke's, but as the opening credits and that excerpt demonstrates, the Landmark series is a renewable format that can be rejigged with newer graphics, better music, and a new point of view. The question of whether the historical canon is truly representative of art making and its social context began to be addressed broadly in the 1980s as the Marxist left tradition of Berger crossfaded with the rise of postmodernity. By the end of the decade, the canon and the landmark art series of Clarke and Hughes was pretty much dead. As I mentioned, the form is renewable as it can reflect changing attitudes of art and its critical reception. It can, in the right hands, be adaptable to an ironic point of view to postmodernity, the rise of art celebrity, the art market, and so on. This Is Modern Art was made for Channel 4 and was the first of a new wave of art programming in the UK. Matthew Collings was a critic and former editor of Art Scribe magazine and contributed to Modern Painters, and he had produced and presented The Late Show for the BBC, which was an arts magazine format show that featured guests such as Damien Hirst and Martin Kippenberger. Unlike the work of most critics and landmark shows that engage with art history, This Is Modern Art connected the work of then current art stars of the young British art period to the history of modernism, Hirst and Emin with Dali and Picasso, Duchamp and so forth. And I just want to show you a little clip here from a segment on Tracey Emin.
I like the shocks of this artist because she had the idea of trying to put feelings back into alienated modern art forms.
A hood was put over my head. My legs and arms were tied behind my back. I was thrown into the boot of a car. I woke up to the smell of jasmine and the sound of beautiful birds. I was lying on a wooden floor. The phone was ringing. I crawled towards the phone and knocked the receiver off with my chin. It was your voice. You said you were coming to save me. A door opened. You picked me up, threw me into bed and started to fuck me like crazy. Like you'd been in prison for 7 years. Your cock was so hard, moving like mad. My head sank deep into the pillow. I was losing consciousness. Like I didn't exist anymore. Like my soul was in heaven. Like I was loving you forever and ever and ever. Like I'd met you in eternity.
Blimey, that's terrible, Tracey. When did that happen? Or was it all a dream? It's our next Shock Stop. Real shocks and staged shocks.
They are going to be fun.
Quiet, please.
Action.
No, not action, actually, because I'm not happy about my tits.
Sort your tits out.
Yeah. Oh, gosh.
And humour. What do you think in your art is genuinely shocking, and what do you think is acting?
This is acting. This is acting. This isn't shocking. This is acting. How many artists are here from that show, from the station? I'm here. I'm drunk. Had a good night out with my friends. I'm leaving now. I'm going to be with my friends. I'm going to be with my mum. There's nowhere with this fucking mic on me.
Tracey Emin, Britain's best-known young British artist behaving badly. Here she is plunging a polite modern art chat show into chaotic darkness.
Oh, thanks.
This Is Modern Art was the recharge that the landmark series format badly needed. With imaginative visuals and a stylish soundtrack, the show broke new ground for the genre. One memorable sequence intercut Collings with archival footage of Dali creating a sort of cross-temporal interview. What does Dali expect from a day of work? Asked Collings. Cash and checks, hissed the maestro from atop a high scaffold. Butterfly, yee! In the 18 years between Shock of the New and This Is Modern Art, the art world had changed immeasurably. We had entered the art of the art superstar, the commodity personality. Whereas Hughes' series had been criticised for its canonical view of art history and his apparent lack of interest in the edges of art practice then emerging, such as video, performance and photography, Collins' show moved effortlessly across all the media and mediums, blending the personal view of the landmark series format with mini artist profiles, such as the Emin section here, and he met and talked with the still living exponents of art making. Since the 1980s, the landmark series, the most comparable art TV format to a televisual history, has changed dramatically. Over the last decade or so, more art TV shows have been made. The landmark series format has largely been neglected for programs that combine art appreciation with other popular subjects such as travel and food. Hybrid concoctions that have actually ended up not satisfying the core audience, which is those people who have an actual interest in art. And the impact of each landmark series has been diminished by an over-familiarity with the format, but also its proliferation. There's been Sister Wendy's 5 series that she did, Ben Lewis's ongoing art safari, Nigel Spivey's How Art Made the World, Simon Sharma's The Power of Art, even Michael Palin's had a go with a show called Michael Palin on Art. And from America, there's only really been one show that's made it out to Australia, and that was Art 21, which was an interesting hybrid of a show that orders artist profiles into 50-minute programs that are themed, memory, whatever, and they're sequenced without a voiceover or a presenter. Until the last few years or so, Australian art was poorly represented outside the magazine format show. We all know Sunday Arts in its new incarnation as Art Nation, and programs such as State of the Arts and Review from back in the early to mid-1980s. It was due to a change of management around 2006 at the ABC that we have begun to see a new roster of productions, new art documentaries, various single episode artist profiles, and the occasional three-part series such as Not Quite Art and The Art Life. When I was first approached with the idea of making something for the ABC in 2007, it was a brief that basically stated that the program was to be an essay. And to be honest, I was uncertain about how to go about it. How would you even begin to address contemporary art making in Australia? It seemed to me that it was an opportunity to present certain facets of art making and to give the art greater context with a compare and contrast methodology. There was also an expectation that I would appear on screen as presenter. And it seemed then that the easiest and most immediately comprehensible way to create a series was to look at the art thematically and by medium. So painting, say, in one episode, photography and video art in another, the context of Australian art on a broader kind of view in the third episode. I don't know if the first series that I made was entirely successful, but I recently spoke to an artist who makes a living teaching art in high school, and he told me that episode 2 from the first series, the episode about postmodernism and electronic imagery, is the episode that he often plays to his students. And I asked him why, and he said it's an easy entry into a complicated subject matter, and since it's only 27 minutes, it fits very neatly into one period. When I think about my own efforts making art TV, they seem incomplete and schematic at best. I think of Series 1 as an indication of some ideas, rather than a fully fleshed out dissertation. Making the show was an interesting insight into the often ad hoc way these programs get made. You think of an area that you want to talk about, say how the practice of painting persists after the repeated declaration of its death. And then you think of artists who might help illustrate that idea. I chose artists whose work seemed to have the most immediate connection to the contemporary world and who might have something interesting to say about the subject. I'll give you just one example of a choice. I had known the work of Del Catherine Barton from her time exhibiting with Ray Hughes Gallery. At the time of making Series 1, she had just moved galleries to Calaman, and although she was reticent to be interviewed and she absolutely forbade us from filming her in her studio, she turned out to be both charming and erudite on camera. She talked about her love of fashion imagery, her painting in relation to film and television, her work in relation to other painters. An interview that before it was edited lasted about 30 minutes. Edited down into the final program, the Del Catherine Barton segment is about 5 minutes. The questions were tailored to elicit certain responses that were going to help me illustrate my overall argument. Including artists in a TV show who are currently working and whose careers have not yet run their course comes with a number of problematic issues attached. Why choose one artist over another? Why choose that particular approach? Should you include music under their art? And if you do, what does that mean? What does it say about the work? Or do you just vibe it up with snappy editing and music and not really care about that sort of stuff? I think what art TV does is actually create an impression. I think of what happened to Del Catherine's career after she was in the art life and wonder how much that appearance added to or maybe even detracted from her career success, such as her subsequent win of the Archibald, her appearance in numerous magazines and so on. I want to stress that I am not laying any claim to her art fame or to that of any other artists who are in the show, but I also know that the art world in Australia is a very small place. And simply being on TV creates a degree of conspicuous visibility. I want to now just show you the opening couple of minutes of the first episode of Series 2 of The Art Life. What is an artist? What do they do? How does the making of art reflect ideas about the nature of creativity?
I've always been interested in these questions because I think the answers reveal something about the nature of art, about the sort of role we want it to play in our society. But I guess, like most people, my first exposure to the idea of an artist and to art wasn't through seeing paintings in a gallery, but through movies, like this one.
This is Kirk Douglas in Vincente Minnelli's 1956 classic Lust for Life. The film celebrates the popular values of what we think an artist is. He is a man who paints pictures inspired by real life. He is a genius who is doomed.
I'd like to go home.
But after his death, his art will live on. Those cliches are powerful because they lay at the heart of what we want to believe about art. That art comes from somewhere real, and although it sometimes seems a bit obscure, art is offered in good faith. I think those are good values, but art can often seem as though it's the opposite, that it's ironic, flippant, a joke.
Starry, starry night, paint your palette blue and green.
Making art is about responding to the world, and the sort of language that's used to create it expresses the conflicted feelings we have about modern life. It seems natural to me that artists should use all emotions, including irony and humour.
Sketch the trees and the daffodils. Catch the breeze and
I've always really loved this song. So sad and yet so hopeful. It makes me think of all those great Vincent van Gogh moments.
In this series, we're going to ask a simple question. What is an artist? And to find an answer, we'll meet some artists and we'll talk about what it means to make art today.
Welcome to the art life.
I think the second series of The Art Life was probably more successful as a piece of writing for television. It had a very direct and simple through line that you could follow from episode to episode, and it encompassed some radically different forms of art making. Say, in the first episode, we started with painters painting in their studios, and by the time we got to like episode 3, there were people who were making situations rather than artworks with neither an object or a market attached. Having learned a few lessons in the making of the first series, the connection between artists and creating a sense of context seemed easier to achieve. I want to conclude by talking briefly about the reception of these shows. The audience for TV arts is conservative and believe their expectations should always be met. Peter Hill once remarked that there is only ever the one arts TV show on TV, and it never seems to be the one we want. I know that the criticism of The Art Life has been about its perceived lack of critical distance, and perhaps that criticism is right in some ways, but I also think the tone has a lot to do with it. A level of irony and playfulness and willingness to engage provides a contrast to the relentless negativity of many conservative art critics in old media hold towards the making of contemporary art. Matthew Collings complained that his own series, This Is Modern Art, was seen in the UK as relentless boosterism for the artists involved in his program. But I think a more sophisticated viewing understands that the inclusion of certain artists in a series and the inevitable change in their level of visibility and what you want to say about them is the result of a sequence of decisions that the writer-presenter has little control over. The second series of The Art Life also demonstrated that viewers of these kinds of programs want the certainty of the generic conventions of the landmark series, but also that they respond to the content in ways that points to the kind of art history they want, if indeed television arts has a role in the creation of history. Series 2 commenced with a series of artists who embodied the contemporary equivalent of the traditional idea of the artist, the painter in their studio. Part 1 stayed pretty close to the traditional form and content before heading off in Part 2 into less familiar territory of performance video art, like that of the Kingpins and Rennie Codgers, who we saw in that excerpt. Episode 3 looked at artists who saw the role of artists as mediators of experience rather than people who create objects. Astra Howard, Squat Space, and so on. I had high hopes that the series would better the ratings of the first, but once they'd aired, you could closely chart a precipitous decline in the ratings from episode 1 as the art making became less and less familiar, until episode 3 had roughly half the numbers of the first episode. People like painting. They like to see artists painting in their studio. They don't care much for drag or political art, and that's just the way it is. Now I want to show you something to conclude. It's a brief clip from one of my favourite art shows. It's Brian Sewell's Grand Tour from 2006. It's a guilty pleasure, and I think it illustrates just exactly how the older styles of TV art history have become a parody, and an enjoyable one. But, well, you'll see.
You've seen the grandeur of the Pitti Palace from outside. You've seen the grandeur of the Pitti Palace within. Now I want to show you something much less grand, though to us it will seem quite grand enough. It is a small room. It is the bedroom of the last Grand Duke of the real Medici. He was a great eccentric. Amongst other things, he did not care for women. He cared for them so little that he couldn't even try to sire an heir. And for the last 10 years or so of his life, he knew that he was the last of the line, that there was no other Medici to come. And so, in a sense, he gave up. He said, I shall enjoy the life I want to lead. I've always wanted. And retired to his bed. His bed was in that alcove where there is now an altar.